As the Russian-led war in Ukraine continues to rage on well into its third year, both sides have begun to run low on necessities from troops to weapons and ammunition that they must have to continue fighting. Estimates as to how many casualties have been suffered in what's become by far the bloodiest conflict in Europe since the Second World War are nothing short of horrific. As of early 2024, estimates from the UK's Ministry of Defence suggest that Russia alone has likely suffered at least 350,000 casualties since the start of the war, divided between some 150,000 Russian soldiers killed in action, along with as many as 200,000 wounded and many more missing. Still, these figures are considerably higher than the estimated casualties on the Ukrainian side, which as of late are believed to stand at around 170,000 in total, split between as many as 70,000 Ukrainian soldiers killed in action, and another 100,000 more wounded. When combined, the reported wartime casualties after around 28 months of fighting are well over 500,000 people, and that's without even mentioning the loss of life endured by Ukraine's civilian population, which according to figures from the UN are already in the tens of thousands. In just over 2 years then, Ukraine has already suffered more loss of life than the entire US military did after nearly 20 years of warfare in Vietnam. And in contrast, the Russian forces have witnessed 10 times as many deaths as the former Soviets did during their decade-long invasion of Afghanistan, in a fraction of the time. The sheer scale of death and destruction in Ukraine is reflective of the enormous volume of lethal weapons that have been burned through in the years following Russia's invasion. For months now, Ukrainian troops have been firing roughly 2,000 rounds of artillery each day compared to Russia's 10,000 per day. And unfortunately for Ukraine, the current stockpiles of shells are barely enough to sustain only a defensive war against the Russians, despite another $60 billion aid package from the Americans earlier this year. Moreover, Ukraine is also running dangerously low on anti-aircraft and defense systems, which they need not only to intercept Russian missiles and stop them from reaching their targets, but also to prevent Russian fighter jets and bombers from taking control of Ukrainian airspace. If they run out of this technology, it'll bring the Russian Air Force into the war in a way that's never been seen before thus far, which would be disastrous for Ukraine. All of this means is that both sides have had to look elsewhere for supplies to support their respective armies and wartime operations, and there's no place on Earth that has a larger arsenal of unused ammunition and artillery shells than on the Korean peninsula. You see, North and South Korea have remained officially at war with one another ever since the signing of an armistice agreement back in 1953, and whilst the agreement ended the gunfire between the two sides, it never formally ended the state of war between them. The war in Korea became the first real armed conflict of the Cold War, and for decades following its onset, both the United States and Soviet Russia poured in tremendous amounts of munitions and weaponry into the hands of their respectively backed sides. The Americans poured their supplies into the south, while the Soviets poured theirs into the north, amid fears of another violent confrontation on the peninsula happening once again. And even though the tensions of the Cold War between the US and Soviet Russia ended back in the 1990s, it never really ended at all on the Korean peninsula, and tensions between them have only continued to escalate all the way up until the present day. As for North Korea, little's really known about its true nature. It exists today as a highly impoverished pariah state that's largely isolated itself from the rest of the world, with shoot-to-kill orders enforced for anybody trying to cross either of its two borders, in either direction. But despite its meagre economy and limited technological growth, the ruling dynasty in North Korea have effectively put the entire country's weight into developing its military and nuclear capabilities. Consequently, North Korea has not only one of the largest and most well-trained armed forces anywhere on the planet, but likely tens of millions of rounds of artillery shells, along with enormous stockpiles of ballistic missiles and rockets too. When Russia formally declared that it was annexing the Ukrainian territories of Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhzhia and Kherson into the country in late 2022, North Korea was one of only 3 countries to formally recognize Moscow's claims, alongside only Belarus and Bashar al-Assad's Syria. Coincidentally, around the same time, the White House reported that Russia's Wagner Group, a private mercenary organization believed to be operating on behalf of the Kremlin, had been procuring shells from North Korea. And whilst Pyongyang initially denied the reports, they've since been far more open to their involvement in the war against Ukraine. After a summit between Russian President Vladimir Putin and North Korea's Supreme Leader Kim Jong-un back in 2023, it was reported that upwards of 1 million artillery shells have been transferred from North Korea to Russia, alongside some 7,000 containers of military equipment which are now reportedly being transferred right from the peninsula all the way to the front lines in Ukraine. Just last week, Putin made an official visit to Pyongyang in his first ever trip to North Korea in over 24 years, during which he and Kim effectively agreed through signing a set of accords that both countries would provide mutual support for one another if either of them were ever attacked. Though much about the summit was left unsaid, it's quite likely that Russia could now have full access to North Korea's enormous inventory of largely Soviet-era munitions, which could well be deployed very soon in huge numbers to Ukraine. North Korea, on the other hand, also benefits greatly from closer ties with Moscow. Because they've become so incredibly isolated and shut off from the rest of the world, North Korea's evidently began to run low on things like energy imports, food, and spare parts for their equipment, which Russia can easily provide to them at a reasonable cost, and not to mention the high-tech military hardware which is also on the cards. A close alliance with the Russians can also help Pyongyang circumvent the endless list of economic sanctions imposed on them by the West, in a sort of clandestine network between the world's most heavily sanctioned countries, and it may mean that Russia could well drop its own financial sanctions on North Korea too. Either way, whatever North Korea may be getting out of this arrangement, it's made their neighbours to the south all the more anxious. You see, just like North Korea, South Korea has also spent the last 70 years preparing for a full-scale war with the North, and in doing so they've developed into a global heavyweight in terms of military capabilities, and as a result, one of the world's most prominent arms exporters too. It's a dramatically wealthier and more technologically advanced country than the North, with an economy that these days is approaching the scale of even Russia itself, despite being a fraction of its size and population. South Korea has thus managed to become a highly influential player in the global arms trade, to the point where it even cracked a spot on the top 10 list of arms exporters in the world back in 2019. If the current administration under Yoon Suk-yeol get their way, South Korea will aim to rapidly expand their arms industry until it becomes the fourth largest exporter of weapons by 2027, behind only the United States, France, and Russia. South Korean arms exports exploded when the Russians invaded Ukraine, but even then, South Korea hasn't actually been able to export weapons directly to Ukraine for use on the battlefield. The Russians, you see, have repeatedly warned South Korea against sending arms directly to Ukraine, and it's threatened to retaliate by assisting North Korea's nuclear and weapons programs if they ever did so. A threat that's made South Korea understandably hesitant to provide Ukraine with any lethal aid directly so far. Instead, they've joined a small list of countries that have chosen to send across only non-lethal aids such as humanitarian support, gear, and financial assistance. Nevertheless, the United States and South Korea have come up with a sort of loophole that gets around South Korea's hesitancy to support the war directly. In this agreement, the United States would supply their own stockpiles of munitions to Ukraine, and then South Korea would either sell or lend their munitions to the Americans to replenish them, provided that the South Korean produced shells would stay firmly within the United States and never be transferred to Ukraine. It's much like how other NATO countries, such as Poland, transferred large amounts of their own, mostly Soviet-era gear to the Ukrainians, and then bought back large amounts of South Korean-produced arms to replace them, provided that they stayed firmly within Poland. If it turns out, however, that Russia were buying up millions of rounds of North Korean-made munitions and then providing Pyongyang with support for their military and nuclear capabilities anyway, South Korea would have no remaining incentive to just use loopholes like this, and they'd have nothing to lose by opening up their gigantic and ever-growing arms industry into the hands of the Ukrainians, which could easily turn the tide of the war. If this does ever happen, it will turn the war in Ukraine into a direct proxy conflict between the two Koreas, with an ironic twist of fate given it's the two arch-rivals of the Cold War that have come back to the Korean peninsula asking for some of their previously gifted arms back to fight with. If North Korean-produced rounds do start suddenly appearing across the battlefield in Ukraine, and North Korea's military starts to become much more advanced around the same time, the Western world shouldn't be massively surprised, and it will need to figure out on how best to react. I hope you managed to learn a thing or two from this video. A lot of effort goes into making them, and if you haven't yet subscribed, now would be a good time to do so. Don't forget to also hit the notification bell so you don't miss out on any future content, and any suggestions for future videos will be much appreciated. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.